You and I have been on a tear as of late when it comes to all things Porsche, really over the past year or so. Started in Greece with the all-new Cayenne, then progressed to the 718 Boxster and Cayman GTS, then Santa Maria Madre de Dios 911 Carrera T, and then most recently with the Panamera GTS we drove on that epic track in Bahrain. Well, it's time to get practical and look at the updated version of the Porsche that pays the bills at Porsche. And just as an aside here, this thing came out, something like 3 years ago, and there was no such thing as a Macan. Now it's by far the best-selling Porsche. We'll talk more about that in coming episodes. But now it's time for a tech review on the updated 2019 Porsche Macan. Being this is a Porsche, let's kick things off underneath the hood. Wait a minute, who am I kidding? We always kick things off underneath the hood. Here it's just a bit more important because of the manufacturer involved. With that, there's a little bit old and there's a little bit new. The old is what's called the Macan, and that's fitted with a 2-liter, 4-cylinder, direct-injected gasoline turbocharged engine. And that's good for 248 horsepower, comes in at 5,000 RPM, good up to 6,750 RPM. Then there's the torque, 273 pounds. That comes in at 1,600 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 4,500 RPM. Then we move along to something called a Macan S, and that does a very unique trick in that it pilfers an engine from the Cayenne that we drove a year ago and then the Panamera, in that it changes to that revised 3-liter single turbocharger engine. Now the output on that is 348 horsepower. That comes in at 5,400 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 6,400 RPM, and then 354 pounds of torque, comes in at a very low 1,340 RPM, stays flat all the way up to 4,800 RPM. Now what's important about that engine is not just that it's a new engine, it's the placement of the turbocharger. And yes, it's not the most powerful engine that Porsche makes, so it's not about like, oh my God, it's a hot V, so therefore it's faster. The concept is more efficiency. And we talked a little bit about this in the Panamera GTS episode, and the idea is to bring the temperature of the emissions control system as well as the turbocharger up to this more efficient running range to be able to get peak power and peak efficiency out of the engine a bit quicker. That's the main trick of this engine, and again, we'll talk more about this in the coming full first drive review. Now let's put that aside, and how does all that power get to all 4 wheels? And that's through anything you want, as long as it's a 7-speed PDK. In the first ever episode of the show, I shared with you one of our important tenets. The one I'm referring to is, I never like to tell you what you can see. So fast forward, almost 10 years later, 900 episodes later, and we're sitting in this stunning pasture somewhere in the Balearic Islands with a solar farm, and something is very obvious here. So my job today is to show you what's not obvious. Now let's start with the steering wheel. That is new to the Macan, but we've seen it in other Porsches. And you know this controller thing here that used to be all down here? Now it controls the Sport Plus, all those modes up here, as well as individual mode and then the individual response button here. And then I think the biggest thing you can see there is the real estate has been changed. So the screen, the bigger screen, and the UX that we saw in the Panamera and the Cayenne, that is now cascaded to the Macan, and to make available real estate for the larger screen, the vents have been reaccommodated. I don't know if I love the look of the vents, but overall, the usability of the new UX in this car now equals the other two. Before you and I move any farther forward, we need to do a bit of a recap back to 3 years ago when Hurley gave us a hot lap in one of these things on Willow Springs and then taught me how to drive it. And then I was utterly blown away by how fast one could take a crossover around a track. And that is to say, a vehicle with a high center of gravity, forget about who built it. And back then I couldn't help but think of the old saying, it's the economy, stupid. Here, it's the suspension setup, stupid. And that is the good reason as to why most of this has not been changed. There's been tweaks, but the basics are very much the same. Like, for example, wishbones in the front, multi-link in the back, and then a myriad of options from standard dampers to adjustable dampers to air ride. Then here are the tweaks, like those wishbones we talked about in the front. Instead of being made out of steel, they're now made out of aluminum. The idea is to lower the weight, but it's still a crossover. And then the wheel and tire setup is one of the bigger changes. So now the wheels on offer 18s to 21s. That changes the tire setup, and this is unusual in that it's a crossover that has a standard staggered front rear wheel and tire setup. Not something you would expect on a family car, more on like a 911. So like the smallest wheel and tire combo in the front is 235/60 R18, goes all the way up to the 21s in the back, 295 35 R21. I giggle when I say that because this is a vehicle you put kids in the back. Then one can layer the myriad of alphabet soup that is on offer from Porsche. So there's PASM, Porsche Torque Vectoring Plus, PTV, and then all of the different chassis controls that we've seen on some of the other cars. Oh, by the way, most of that is optional on Macan, even though it's standard on the Panamera GTS we drove in Bahrain. Then on top of all that, there have been some tweaks to the air ride. There have been some tweaks to the dampers in the PASM setup. And this is coming in the full first drive review because we do drive both. A car that has PASM but not air ride, but one cannot have an air ride car without PASM, if that's not confusing enough. We'll figure it out in the full first drive review, so make sure you come back for that. Upon reflection back at the hangar in the good old US of A, on an unusually rainy, cold, and windy California day, I've come to the realization that we covered a ridiculous amount of technical information in this tech review of the 2019 Porsche Macan. So let's put a pin in it there and pick it up in the next episode, and this is where we need to talk a little bit about logistics. We talked about 2 engines in this episode, which means we're going to have 2 full first drive reviews, one on that V6 Macan and then one on the 4-cylinder turbo. And unlike the recent spat of like Lexus and Hyundai episodes, we're going to do this in sequential order. So think of it as like Porsche Macan week here at the old show. In the interim, I'm going to leave you with a question, and this is going to be a very specific question. What do you feel really competes with the Macan, like effectively competes with the Macan? And I'm looking for some creative answers here. Is it crossovers, is it trucks, or is it cars? And I ask for a very specific reason, because at the end of this 3-episode arc, I'm going to present to you some information that I found disturbing, that maybe you won't find disturbing, but I promise you will cast a new light on the crossover world and maybe even the car business. So think of that as a hell of a cliffhanger. But in the interim, what do you feel effectively competes with the Macan and why? And you know what? Let me know what region of the world you hail from. Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV on Word, MotoManTV on Word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I do have to share a little bit of the travel that was involved in this particular trip. As you know, if you follow me on Instagram, good, bad, or indifferent, the longest single relationship I have ever had in my life is with one airline. So I am no stranger to security at airports, but the worst ever experience I have ever had in my life, and that's inclusive of like Istanbul Airport or London Heathrow, was at Palma, Spain. I was blown away at how ineffective their security people were there. Doesn't mean I don't love Spain, because I really do love Spain, and I'm going to be going back in January. But just want to share that because I was so blown away at how the whole thing was handled. Anyway, with that, until I see you next time in the V6 Macan first drive review, bis später.